Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little, and in this video I will be teaching you the fundamentals of No Limit Texas Hold'em. But really, you're going to be getting two videos in one. While I'm teaching you guys, I'll also be playing 4 online multi-table tournament sit-and-goes at the same time. When the action heats up in the games, I'll tell you what I'm thinking in these world poker situations. I also suggest that you watch this video multiple times so that you make sure that you absorb all the information. This should be fun. Let's get started. What I have loaded up here are multi-table sit-and-goes. These will be 180-person sit-and-goes, and they'll be of the turbo variety. And the reason I'm doing turbos is so that we can get a lot more information out of these videos. If I did the non-turbo games, I wouldn't be able to get near as many situations. So in the bottom left-hand table, we have an $11 turbo sit-and-go with 180 people. The bottom right-hand game, we have a $2 turbo sit-and-go with 180 people. And also, notice I have a $3 rebuy turbo sit-and-go loading up. And then I have a $7 one loading up as well. And as you can see on PokerStars, you can play 45-person sit-and-goes, 90-person sit-and-goes, 18-person sit-and-goes. You can pretty much play whatever you want. And I want to go ahead and talk about the rebuy tournaments just a little bit. Basically, you always want to rebuy if you have less than the starting stack. And in general, you should basically always rebuy, assuming you think you're one of the better players at the table. Right here with King 10 offsuit, this is a spot where I see a lot of players make a mistake by either calling or raising here. Really, King 10, hands like King 10, Ace 3, they're just very marginal, and really they're not very good to play. You can simply avoid them. As you can see, the $7 game isn't really loading up, so I'm going to load up another $11 table. Basically, what you need to do in these sit-and-goes is play pretty tight and aggressive in the early stages of the game. And then as the blinds get higher, you'll have to start going all in a lot more. Right here with 7-8 suited, this is a great hand to see a cheap flop with. And notice we got in for 20 chips. And even if it was a raise to 60 and there was a call, I would still definitely call along. Because hands like 7-8 suited, 5-6 suited, 10-9 suited, whatever, those are called suited connectors, and they flop very well. When I say they flop very well, I mean they flop good draws a lot of the time. And right here, this really isn't a good draw. Notice we have, it's called a gut shot, where we have 4 cards to make the nut straight, but it's not really worth calling here to try to get to it. I guess I'll tell you guys a little bit about myself. I started playing poker when I was 18 years old. I'm 24 now. I started off with $50 playing 25-cent, 50-cent limit, which was the smallest stakes available online at that time, 6 years ago. And I moved over to sit-and-goes whenever I turned about 20, and I grinded sit-and-goes for a year or two. I played the biggest games available online at the time, and did pretty well at them. When I turned 21, I started playing multi-table tournaments in the live casinos, and I didn't really do well my first year. I realized later that I was playing a bit too tight. But once I realized that, I played a little bit more loose and had really good results. I've ended up winning about $4 million in the live poker tournaments and about $500,000 online in poker tournaments. I've taken second in the Sunday Million on PokerStars, which is basically the biggest tournament run every week. I think I got like $120,000 for that, and I took fourth in a full tilt Sunday tournament, their big Sunday tournament once. I think I got like $80,000 for that. So I've done pretty well in mine. And those tournaments, they're very similar structured to these turbo sit-and-goes, because you really just don't have a whole lot of play. Play is what's referred to as whenever you have a lot of big blinds compared to the blinds. Like right here, notice we have 3,000 chips, and the blinds are only 10, 20. So we have 150 big blinds, which is a pretty decent stack. And that's how most online tournaments start out, but very quickly you'll notice that we're going to get down to about 10 big blinds. The blinds are going to escalate very quickly, and before we know it, we're going to be in bad shape. Alright, notice this is the rebuy tournament here, and because of that, I'm going to actually call here, but if this was a regular tournament, I think you just need to fold. In the beginning of these rebuy tournaments, people tend to skew their chips around quite liberally, and we can expect to get it in good here a decent amount of time, or coin flipping, and right here we were coin flipping. And that's fine. You can't really turn down coin flips in rebuy tournaments. And we lost the hand, but, you know, whenever you have overcards against a small pair, you have about 50% equity. Equity is referred to how much of the pot you actually own. You're going to notice in the top right-hand table, I'm going to be calling all in to quite a bit more loosely in the early levels, just because it's a rebuy tournament. All right, now notice how I was down to 10 chips. I could have rebought right there up to 1,500 10 chips, but if I lose this 10 chips, I can then rebuy twice and get back up to 3,000 chips. I just want to point out that this guy probably didn't make a bad play with his eights. Again, he realized this is a rebuy tournament. He'd already rebought, so he's probably a competent player. And, you know, it wasn't a bad play. And in spots like that, you know, my call was okay, his push was okay. Neither of us made a bad play. However, one of us is going to lose that hand. And unfortunately, it was me, but in spots like that where you really can't do anything about the result, you just don't worry about it. A lot of players get stuck on, when they get unlucky, they go on what's called tilt, which is where you kind of lose all control of everything, and you just end up throwing away your money. And that's the absolute last thing you want to do in poker, is throw away your money. You need to make sure you're getting your money in good, where you have lots of equity, and you'll end up profiting in the long run. These tournaments like this actually have very high variance. And variance is when you know, most of the time on any individual tournament, you're going to lose money on average. But occasionally you're going to win a lot of money. Right here with the Queen 6, notice our opponent bets 160 into a 100 chip pot. And right here we're drawing to the very lowest end of the straight. If a 5 comes or a 10 comes, we'll have a straight, but it'll be a bad straight. So in this spot right there, it's a very easy fold. You're not really getting great pot odds. Pot odds are when you compare the amount of money in the pot to how much to your percentage that you're going to win. So you can figure out how many outs you have. An out is where you have, like right there we had 8 outs. We had 4 5s and 4 10s. So we had about 1/5 of the deck. So we need to be getting about 5 to 1 to call. Right there we were getting like 1.5 to 1 or something, which isn't very good. Right here with 10s, I'm definitely going to re-raise. Notice in these turbo multi-table sit and goes, you can't really be scared to go broke with any pretty good hand. And if we do go broke, that's fine. We'll just load up another table. And when you're playing these games, you want to make sure you have a pretty big bankroll compared to the buy-in. In general, you want to have something like 100 buy-ins. So if you're playing $10 games, you need about $1,000, which sounds like a lot, but notice if we look at the lobby, the tournament lobby here, they have games all the way down to 10 cents, or they actually have 1 cent games. All right, right here we flopped a set, which is 3 of a kind, where I have 2 of them in my hand. Notice my opponent only has 1,000 chips behind him. Because of that, I want to bet small so that he'll think that he might can take me off my hand if he goes all in. You always want to make sure your opponent thinks they can bluff you. And that's something that a lot of amateur players don't do. Like, they would just go all in here because they think they have a very good hand. But really, you want to give your opponent a chance to bluff. And he got really unlucky that he had a set as well. That's about one of the best spots you can get in poker because he only has 1 out. He has to hit exactly a 9 to win. He actually had the backdoor flush draw too, which might have came in. Let's go back to this hand. Notice PokerStars has this neat little replay where you can replay what happened if you had a hand. I'm going to talk about how much, whenever you're raising pre-flop, you need to raise to about 3 times the big blind, which is what this opponent did, which is pretty good. Whenever it gets back to me, I'm usually going to need to make it about, if there was only 1 raiser, I would want to make it about 3 times what he made it. But for each caller, I'm going to need to make it an extra size of his raise. So I normally make it about 180 chips. But since there are 2 callers, I need to make it 180 plus 60 plus 60, so about 300 chips. So that's actually exactly what I did. You can go a little bit more, a little less, but in general, the formula you need to use is to make it 3 times what the raiser made it, plus an extra raise size for each additional caller. Right here with Ace King, I'm going to do the same thing I was just talking about. I'm going to make it about 3 times what this opponent made it, which is about 360 chips. And again, if he goes all in here, I'm definitely going to just call. You can't really be scared to go broke with big hands. Right here, this is a great spot to slow play. I flop top pair, top kicker, which is a very good hand, and really my opponent probably doesn't have very much equity in this hand. So I'm going to check and hopefully make my opponent think I don't have a king. And if he bets here, I'm probably just going to call, and then I'm going to get it in on any river. Although right here I could push as well. I think I actually am just going to go all in, because there are a few more draws out. If he has 7-8 or something like Queen-Jack, you really don't, you want to make him pay to get there. And we did go all in and he folded, and whenever you go all in, you take away your opponent's opportunity to bluff. But sometimes, once the board kind of runs out, a little bit scarier. Like for example, say the turn was a three of diamonds. On that turn, I would have just called and then let him bluff on the river, because there are really no bad river cards. You know, of course, if he has like Queen Jack and it comes 10, then I would lose. But you know, if you get unlucky in spots like that, you just get unlucky and you can move on. Right here with Ace Queen, I'm definitely just going to go all in. Again, this is the rebuy tournament, and you can't really be scared to make big all-in plays in the beginning levels of a rebuy tournament. You have to kind of try to go out of your way to get chips. Right here with King Queen, you can raise or call. I think I'm just going to call. You don't really mind seeing a flop of King Queen. It's not the greatest hand to play multi-way, but if I make it, say, 150, or if I make it like 170 or 180 chips and get raised, then I'm in a pretty rough spot, because, you know, my hand is pretty good, but it's not. And then at the same time, there are going to be a lot of flops that aren't really that great for me. This, of course, isn't one of those. This is an excellent flop. And we're definitely going to bet this, and since our opponent made a small bet, I'm going to go ahead and raise him, because there is a diamond draw out there, and if he does have a diamond draw, he'll probably call. When you raise, you want to raise something near the size of the pot, or a little bit less. Notice the pot had 225 chips in it, or something like that. So I made it 210, which is a little bit less than pot, but still fine. The diamond got there on the turn, which is not really good. And at this point, I think I'm just going to check behind on the turn. He actually bet the minimum into us, which is good, because, you know, lets us see a cheap river card. And if he checks to us on the river, I'm definitely going to bet for value. And since he made the minimum bet, I think I'm going to go ahead and raise for value. And if he goes all in, I'm going to be in a rough spot, but I think you'll get a lot of value here. I think he'll only push all in with a full house or a very good flush. So I raised for value, and he called and then folded his hand. So I suspect he had something like a pair of tens or something like that, but we'll check it out. He had a pair of eights, so basically the same thing as a pair of tens there. And actually, he played his hand really bad. He probably should have check called the flop and then given up on the turn. That's a spot where you just kind of need to, you know, not put a whole lot of money in with your pair of eights. And he tried to not put a lot of money in. He tried to bet the minimum very small. But, you know, I kind of sensed that he had something like a pair of tens, a pair of eights, or whatever. And I thought he'd call a raise. And if he went all in over the top of me, I would have been in a pretty tricky spot, because my hand does have a ton of value, but not a whole lot of value against the hands that he's going to be playing back at me now. Anyways, we're doing pretty good in these tournaments so far. We've doubled up here. We've won about 600 chips here. We did get a bit unlucky and lost a coin flip in this tournament, but again, you know, you can't really worry about when you lose a coin flip. So far, I think we've played pretty well. Granted, we're only a few minutes into the video, so it's going to be a long day of videos. Whenever I play poker, I generally try to play fairly long sessions. Especially when you play sit and goes, you need to just be willing to sit there basically all day and load up more games as you lose. Right here at 10-8 suited, again, I said earlier that I like to see cheap flops with these hands. The problem is this guy only has 600 chips, or 250 chips behind, which means that I'm not going to have very good implied odds if I hit my hand. When you raise with a hand like 10-8, you want to make sure you can get paid off very well if you hit your hand. And if your opponent has no chips to pay you off, then it doesn't really make sense to call those hands. Right here with Ace-King again, this is basically a monster in these games, and we're definitely going to call. And we have a coin flip, again. Hopefully we can win one. Doesn't really look like it, though. And we don't. Right here with eights, again, this is the rebuy tournament, so we're going to go ahead and get it in. And, you know, eights aren't a great hand, but it's not really that bad. It's never like that big of an error here, because even if you do lose a hand, you can just rebuy some more chips. I suggest, though, when you first start playing poker, to not play the rebuy tournaments, because you can lose a lot of money relatively quickly. And we got in very good against our opponent's 7th. However, it doesn't really matter because he hit a 7th. In spots like that, though, you have to be very happy that you have tons of equity. Let's talk about running bad real quick. So far, we've been running pretty awful in these tournaments. We've lost 2 coin flips, and then that's called getting 2-outered, because your opponent has 2 7s that he can hit to beat you. And usually in this spot, your opponent has about 20% equity, which means they're going to win the hand about 20% of the time. And, you know, unfortunately, sometimes the 20% happens, and you just lose some chips. But you can't let that bother you, and that's just part of the game. And the reason that bad players constantly play the game is because they get lucky from time to time and they win. I know quite a few players that play even the biggest buy-in tournaments, like $25,000 buy-in tournaments, and they still play and they play poorly just because maybe a time or two they've done pretty well in it. And even the bad players are going to win sometimes, and that's okay. You don't really mind if the bad players win. Right here I'm going to call behind. Had he have raised, I would have called, and if he folded to me, I would have raised myself. And generally you need a stronger hand to call a raise than you do to raise, but that's called the, what's that called? It's called some sort of theorem, and it's written about, it's called the gap theory. That's what it is. Basically, you need a stronger hand to call a raise than you do to actually raise yourself, because if you raise yourself, you have the opportunity to force your opponents out of the hand. Right here, I'm actually going to go all in, because I'm most likely only going to get called by one opponent. And if I do, I probably still have about 40% equity. And notice that there are going to be, if I get called by one opponent, there are going to be 600 dead chips in the pot. So what I suspect to happen here is this opponent's going to call, and hopefully the other players fold. And if they don't, worst case scenario, I can get to rebuy some more chips. So, you know, it's never really a bad thing. Ideally, though, I would go all in, this guy would call, and everyone else would fold. That's exactly what happened, and we get it in with 40% equity. And hopefully we can win one of these. But it's not looking like it. And right here, basically, he has about 60% equity, right? And with 600 dead chips in the pot, I'm basically getting a little better than 1.5 to 1. I mean, like 1.7 to 1. Which means I only really need to win the hand about 35% of the time to make it a good play. And I was going to win the hand something like 40% of the time, which is absolutely fine. I pushed for 10 big blinds with my very small stack. And I won it, which really isn't that great. It's always good to win a hand, but I was you're almost hoping to lose because you get to get 3,000 chips if you lose, whereas now I'm stuck with a 1,000 chip stack. And also notice the blinds are getting higher on every table. We're up to 50, 100 on most of the games. And because of that, we're going to have to start going all in quite a bit. Whenever your stack gets to around 10 big blinds or less, and you're the first person to act, you generally need to be going all in to usually just pick up the blinds and to force your opponents out of the hand. If my opponent here had a lot more chips, I would be pushing all in, but since he's so short, he's probably going to call my all in, and you don't want to get called when you have 9-8. It's always important to pay attention to your opponent's stack sizes. If you're just looking at your stack and your cards, you're not going to do very well in poker. You need to make sure you're paying attention to everything. Like, for example, if I saw an opponent up here going all in every hand, I'd be much more prone to call him with a weaker hand. But if I knew him to be a tight player, then I'd be a little bit more cautious myself. And also, again, like right here, this opponent's going to be pretty prone to call my all in just because he's getting relatively short. He only has 5 big blinds, which is basically nothing. And in spots like that, you have no fold equity. Fold equity is how much you expect to gain by your opponents folding their hand. And if I went all in here and my opponents would fold like King Jack, then I'd be making a lot of money off this hand. And again, right here, this is a spot where I have a lot of fold equity. This opponent just limped, which means he probably has a pretty weak hand. And he's not going to be very prone to call my all in. And because of that, I expect to pick up that 250 chips quite a bit at a time. Same thing right here with King 10. My opponent probably doesn't have much. I mean, he has a random hand. So he's not going to call very often. And I expect to pick up that 100 chips quite a bit. Right here I raised with jacks and flopped to the set again. And I made a small bet. Again, you want to make sure your opponents think that you can fold if they go all in. So I bet about half the pot. Very rarely do you want to bet less than half the pot unless your opponent has a very short stack to where it only makes sense. In general, though, you want to be betting about half to two-thirds the pot whenever you're making a continuation bet. Let's call it a continuation bet when you bet after you raise pre-flop. The reason I didn't slow play on this last hand is because, if you notice, there are going to be 4 people in this hand, which means someone probably has something. And on this board of Jack 6-5 with 2 spades, my opponent could have a spade draw, 7-8, they could have a jack themselves, they could have a pair of 6s. You know, they could have all kinds of stuff that connect with this board, and because of that, you want to make sure you get a lot of money in the pot. Again, I have 10 big blinds or less here, and it's also a rebuy tournament, so if I lose, I can rebuy, which is fine. So we push the queen-jack suited. We run into the aces and the king-queen. So that's not very good. We actually get there and win the pot, which is pretty sick. Unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of chips. If I had a lot of chips there, I would have won a lot of money. Once the blinds get higher in relation to your actual stack size, like notice we only have 30 big blinds. In spots like that, you need to start raising a little bit less pre-flop. And so right there I raised 250 chips. And the reason for that is because when you do get re-raised back on, when people re-raise you want to make sure you're losing the minimum. Right here, we have 4 outs to a 10, and really only 3 of them are clean because one of them is the 10 of spades. But despite that, we can still call 100 chips here to hopefully peel off the 10 on the turn. Right here with king-jack from first position, I think this is just a fold because there's so many people behind us to act, someone's going to pick up a hand. Right here with jack 5, I think this is a pretty easy fold. We don't really beat a whole lot except for a total bluff. Even if he has something like ace-10, he still has a lot of equity against us. And to figure out poker equities, I suggest you guys go to a program like 2dimes.net or ProPokerTools.com. Those sites, they are basically a hand equity calculator, which will tell you what percent you expect to win. Right here, again, this is a spot where my opponent tends to fold a lot of the time if I go all in. So I'm going to go ahead and go all in here, and he does fold. So that's excellent. With queen 10 here, I'm just going to call and try to get a cheap flop. I'm going to go ahead and make a lead here. This isn't something I do all the time, but I think this is a board where I don't really mind going broke, because if a jack comes, I probably have the winning hand. And if it doesn't come, I still have top pair, which is pretty good. I got 2 callers, and on the turn I'm going to check and probably go all in if Johnny 15 goes all in, or if he bets. Now there's a bet and a call. This is a pretty interesting spot because my opponents probably have something. I think I'm going to go ahead and call here and then reevaluate the river. I'm just going to check on this river for sure. Right here with king-jack, this opponent doesn't really have to have anything, so I decided to hop in and hopefully we can win it. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. And it doesn't, so I'm going to load up another game. And a lot of the time in these multi-person sit-and-goes, you're going to crash and burn relatively quickly. But occasionally you're going to get a chip stack and you're just going to rise to the top extraordinarily fast. Right here with the queen now, it's pretty clear to me that we do not have the best hand, so I'm just going to fold this hand. Yeah, I'm not really too worried about the ace. I'm more so worried that this opponent here has something like a straight that he flopped, which he did show it actually. You should never show your cards. It's one of the dumbest things you can do because while I was left guessing, now I know for a fact that I made a good play. And the last thing you want your opponents to do is you don't want to reinforce your opponents that they're playing very well. And right there, our opponent pretty much played his hand into the ground. If he had raised me on the flop, I definitely would have gotten in with it. And this is actually a spot where slow playing is pretty bad because your opponents can actually have a pretty good piece of this flop with queen 9-8. Whenever I'm betting there, like the very minimum I have is something like a 9. And I don't really mind putting a lot of money in with a lot of hands that I'm leading there with. So I'm glad this opponent slow played because he basically saved me my whole stack. And one of the reasons poker is so profitable is because people slow play in poor spots. While there's a little bit of dead time, I guess we'll talk about how multi-table tournament sit-and-goes like what we're playing right now are different than regular multi-table tournaments. And in general, these turbo sit and goes, the blinds go up quite a bit quicker, which will decrease the amount of skill involved to play the game. But you'll get to play many more games per hour, which makes these games actually more profitable than the slower games. And also, there aren't very many people. There are only 180 people, which sounds like a lot of people, but if you play some of the tournaments, especially on Sunday is the main day where online tournaments get really huge, you'll be playing in fields of 20,000 people sometimes, and it's a lot harder to win a tournament with 20,000 people than a tournament with 180 people. And basically, the larger the number of people you're playing against, the bigger swings you're going to have. And when you're first starting out playing poker, you definitely want to minimize the swings involved. And because of that, I suggest you play either 9-handed sit and goes, or some form of sit and go in general. Because usually the maximum number of people those have are 180 people or so. And notice, if we go back and take a look at the lobby here, you can play sit and goes down to very small amounts. Right here I'm going to raise with the ace-8. Notice the big blind sitting out, which means he's not going to be able to play the hand. Now, I don't really mind calling this guy's push if he goes all in, because he's relatively short stack. Anyways, you can go back, you can play the sit and goes all the way down to 1 cent. 1 cent, 990 person sit and goes. And then you got 10-cent games and all that, and you can actually build a bankroll up from that. Right here I flopped top pair, which I think is good enough to go ahead and bet and call this guy's push if he decides to go all in. And when he does go all in here, you have to realize you are going to be beat from time to time, but your hand is so strong to where it doesn't really matter what he has. Really, what I suggest you guys do though is, try to get like a $300 bankroll together, or $400 bankroll, something like that, and come play like the 40 person, or I can't talk, the $4 180 person sit and goes, or something like the $3 180 person sit and goes, or the $2 ones, whatever. They're somewhere between the $6 and the $4 games. That way, if you win one of these sit and goes, like even a $4 one, first place is $216, which is pretty big. And also, you'll have a big enough bankroll to where you can move down if you start to lose some. Like, say you start with a $400 bankroll and you get down to $200. Don't be scared to move down to the $2 games. It's whenever anyone starts playing poker, they're almost always going to lose in the beginning, and that's okay because you have to get some experience. And I definitely suggest you guys get cheap experience against players that aren't that great, and you can grind out a little bit of money and progress your bankroll. That's actually what I started doing. When I played 25 cent, 50 cent, which was very small back a long time ago. Actually, it wasn't that small, but anyways, I grinded my money up, and I didn't do too well initially, but I never really lost my $50, so it was okay. And slowly but surely, I progressed up the ranks, and I eventually got up to $30, $60 limit, which was huge because my initial buy-in was only $50 to poker in general. What I did when I first started playing, though, is I studied quite a bit of poker books. Right here I raised to 450 chips. King 10 suited isn't the greatest hand, but notice a lot of these players behind me, like these two guys, they have a very short stack, and because of that, I'm not going to be too concerned if they go all in because I can just call. And if one of these bigger guys push, I can pretty much safely fold. Right here there's a bet and call in front of me, and this is a very easy spot just to get out of the way now. Right here with a pair of fives, I decided to just limp in. You can raise or call. Folding would be basically out of the question at these low-stake games. Basically, you're trying to hit 3 of a kind here, and if you don't hit 3 of a kind, you can be okay with just folding the hand after the flop. If you do hit 3 of a kind, you expect to get paid off pretty well a lot of the time. Notice we have a flush here, but it's not a very good flush. I'm just going to check, and I'll probably call one bet. Now on the river, I'm going to go ahead and fire out a small bet here. Actually, I'm going to fire out 60 chips into a 70 chip pot, and hope my opponent looks me up with anything. Because he would expect us to be splitting that pot a lot of the time. And he did call me, and notice he actually had a 3 of diamonds, so we got some value out of a very poor hand, and that's always very good to get value out of hands that don't really have any value. Right here with Queen 8, if they fold to me, notice my opponent only has 6 big blinds, and because of that, I'm definitely going to be going all in with this hand to try to make my opponent fold. There's a lot of value in poker in making your opponents fold their hands. And that's really how you win all sorts of poker tournaments, is you make sure your opponents are folding in spots where they should be calling. Right here with Ace 7, this opponent made it 5 times the big blind from early position. That's usually a sign of a pretty strong hand. And whenever they make that play, we have a very easy fold. That was my little thing in the bottom telling me how long these videos go. I'm going to have to take a break every 40 minutes or so, because if I record longer than 40 minutes, the audio starts getting a little bit messed up due to the large file size of these videos, because I'm recording basically my entire computer monitor here. So I want to make sure the audio and everything is good for you guys. It'd be a disaster if I made a video for 8 hours and the audio is no good. Right here I'm going to raise the Queen 10. It's not the greatest hand, but we are on the button. It's very important that you have position on your opponents, which means you're the last person to act, because you get a lot of information. Like if your opponent checks, you now have a little bit of information about their hand. And being in late position is very important. One of my opponents actually just asked if I was in the video, and I'm not going to respond because it should be clear, because I don't ever play $10 games, but actually I am going to say yeah. Right here I push with the Ace-Jack over a limp. Again, when people limp in these tournaments, they usually don't have a very strong hand. And because of that, we can get away with going all in quite a bit. Right here with King 7 suited, again, this is a spot where I do expect to get called by this opponent because he's so short, but I expect there to be about 700 dead chips in the pot, because I'm pretty certain this opponent here will fold. And occasionally this opponent will even fold, which will be a huge success. And if he does call, I have a hand that's going to play okay. King 7 suited isn't the end of the world. And we actually get it in good against Queen 5, which is pretty hilarious. I don't know why this guy called with Queen 5. Hope he doesn't hit on me. But he does. This has basically been a video of me getting extraordinarily unlucky the entire time. But that's okay. You know, and in poker, there are going to be days where you just lose everything you play. And while that is obviously no fun, you know, it's part of the game. I want to go back to this hand, actually. Okay, right here, the rebuy period is over. We're going to have a 5-minute break, and then we can add on our chips, which means you get to pay $3 more and get a few more chips. Right here, notice that we're having to put in actually 700 chips to win a pot of this opponent's 700, my 700, and another 800. So we're basically putting in 700 chips to win 2,300 chips or so. So we're getting about 2 to 1 on our money. And because of that, we only need to win this hand 33% of the time. But once we see the cards revealed, we're actually going to win this hand like 45 or 40% of the time. And that's I'm sorry, not 40%. We're going to win it like 60% of the time, which is huge. So we picked up a ton of equity in this pot. So we put it, basically what you can do is notice the pot's 2,200, right? We put in 700 of these chips, but we're going to get about 1,400 of the chips out of there. So we make 700 chips in equity by making that play. And that is pretty giant to get 700 free chips. Alright, so now in the top right-hand table, it is no longer a rebuy tournament for all practical purposes. It's now just like these other tournaments, except for we're a little bit deeper stacked because everyone has had opportunities to rebuy. Right here, these opponents are going nuts. I expect them to show up with both very strong hands. One opponent has the absolute nuts, and the other person has a 2-pair with a flush draw, which is also extraordinarily strong. Whenever you get a big hand and sit goes, I know I'm going to keep saying this over and over, but whenever you get a pretty big hand, you can't be scared to get it in. Just because your opponents, especially at the lower stake buy-in games, they're going to be getting in with a very wide range of hands. A range that is basically whenever someone goes all in, it's very hard to put them on a specific hand. You'll see people on television a lot. They'll say, "Oh, I put him on ace king," but in reality, if you're pinpointing someone on one exact hand, you're not playing very well. Like for example, if someone raises pre-flop, or you say you raise and someone re-raises you, they're not only re-raising with ace king. You know, they're going to be re-raising you with aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, nines, ace king, ace queen. They can have that entire range of hands. And whenever you're playing, you need to make sure you're constantly trying to narrow your opponent's range down by how they play after the flop. But at the same time, don't really put them on a specific hand and stick to it. It's a pretty losing proposition. Right here with a 6-3, I'm actually going to go all in if they fold to me. Because again, you want to make sure your opponents are folding. And in the bottom right-hand table, we only have 6 big blinds left. And because of that, we're going to have to be getting it in with any decent hand if we pick up something. Obviously 5-4 is no good. And notice, since my opponent raised up here, we're just going to fold. With this 3-2, I could consider pushing. I think it's actually pretty close. Closer than you would think it would be. I mean, you would think with 3-2 it's an easy fold, but it's very similar to the 6-3 spot up here. If I had a few more chips, like 1,600 chips, I would definitely go all in, but you know, thankfully our opponent went all in front of us, and we can now fold. And we're glad that he folded, because we would have been in a mess. Right here with a 7-6, I'm definitely going to go all in if they fold to me. You know, a lot of the time in these sit and goes, if people fold you, you go all in, and if they don't, you just fold. Basically, you don't need to be calling all ins very often, but at the same time, you do need to be pushing all in quite a bit. So when we talk about like the fundamentals of the game, playing online will basically force you to learn to play fundamentally strong, because you can't really make reads on people and all that type of thing like you can in live poker, so you're forced to playing your cards fairly well. And because I think everyone that plays poker should play online to some extent, because it'll help you keep your game fundamentally sound. Right here there's a limp, which again doesn't mean he has a strong hand. So we went all in with King 10, and he called us with Queen 10, so it's another excellent spot for us. I don't know if we've gotten it in bad yet in these tournaments besides the one hand where the guy had aces. So we're doing pretty good when it comes to the getting it in good department. You know, normally when you make plays like that, you're going to get called sometimes whenever you have the worst hand. And when that happens, you can't really worry about it. This opponent right here has been pretty aggressive so far. He's raised the last few hands in a row. If I had something like ace-10 suited there, I would definitely go all in. But notice that with 2,700 chips, I don't really have a whole lot of fold equity, because my opponent only has to call 2,000 more chips to win a pretty big pot. So we have to expect to get looked up quite a bit when we go all in with right there. And you don't really want to get all in knowing you're going to get called with ace-8. However, this opponent looks like they're actually thinking about calling only 1,000 chips more, which would be a disaster. I mean, it'd be awful if he ever folded there. And notice our opponent did have ace-9, and we would have ended up losing this hand. And again, I want to reiterate that you can play absolutely perfect and still lose. Like for example, this opponent with queens did not make a bad play whatsoever. However, he still lost. And that's going to happen to you quite a few times in a row on a day-to-day basis. And when it does happen to you, you can't really worry about it. I also want to point out that I'm playing 4 tables right here, but whenever I play sit and goes, I normally play something like 20 tables. And the reason I play a lot of tables at a time is because you want to get in as many tournaments as possible per day. Because you're going to make some amount of money per tournament throughout each day. Right here, this opponent had a lot more chips I could consider calling, but you know, really we don't have a very deep stack, and we don't expect to get paid off if our opponent does call us, or if we hit our hand, we don't expect to get paid off very well. Right here with the Queen Jack suited, same principle as before. We have an opponent that limps, so we're going to go all in here and hopefully pick up the pot. And also notice that when people limp, sometimes they're not always going to have a bad hand. Sometimes they actually are going to wake up with something pretty decent. So from time to time, you are going to get called, and your opponent's going to show you aces. But for the most part, it's going to be very profitable. Right here, this opponent min raises again. And if I was in later position, like say I was in the on the button, which would be right here, and he was in the cutoff. The cutoff is a position next to the button. I would definitely push, but since there are so many players behind me, one of them might wake up with a hand, and I'd be in pretty bad shape. I'm going to go ahead and pause this video after we take care of this ace-queen hand up here. And then I'll be right back with the next section. And again, this appears like it's going to be one of those spots where you can just make it easy all in. And I'm also going to go all in with the king-queen suited. It's a very strong hand. Right here, notice we have about 20 times the blind, and that's almost a bit too big to go all in. However, it's still going to be pretty profitable. This guy right here, B-Fizz, he's actually a student of mine, which is kind of cool. I didn't even notice him playing. I guess that was the guy that made the good play. Alright, so we pick up that pot. We're up to 6,000 chips, and I'm going to go ahead and pause this video, and we'll be back with the next part.